In 1982, there were hardly bigger names in the horror genre than Stephen King and George Romero. Romero was already the zombie master, having created the seminal zombie film, Night of the Living Dead in 1968, and its follow-up, the epic satirical gore fest, Dawn of the Dead. Stephen King was a household name even all those years ago, and was known as the popular author of Carrie, Salem's Lot, and The Shining, all of which had been made into movies at that point. Having these two collaborate on anything was guaranteed to be a treat for horror lovers everywhere. But the news that their collaboration would be an ode to the twisted EC comics of the 1950s must have been simply intoxicating. But as we know, no cinema classic makes it to the big screen without going through a little bit of hell here and there. So put your Father's Day cake down for a few moments while we take you behind the scenes of one of the great anthologies of all time, and figure out what the f*** happened to 1982's Creepshow. Funnily enough, Creepshow may not have even happened had a few projects not fallen apart first. In 1977, after a few years of not working in film at all, Romero had a new picture under his belt, Martin, a low-budget but scarily effective tale of a disturbed young man who thinks he's a vampire. Romero screened the film at the Cannes Film Festival, reigniting interest in him as a filmmaker who could make cheap yet thought-provoking horror movies. Warner Brothers at the time was working to make King's successful sophomore novel Salem's Lot into a movie, and having just seen Martin, they thought Romero would be a good fit for the job. The studio decided to hook the two geniuses up, and Romero went up to Maine to meet with King. As could have been expected, King and Romero hit it off very well, and while they did talk about doing Salem's Lot, they were more interested in working on King's apocalyptic novel, The Stand. The book, as originally released, was over 800 pages long, featured a sizable ensemble of main characters, and contained dozens of locations and important set pieces. Simply put, it was going to be a very large film, much larger than the kind Romero and Rubinstein were used to putting together. As they held on to hope that they'd be able to see it through, Romero and King thought about collaborating on something else. Something smaller in scale, but with grand ambitions, which might convince studio execs to let them move forward in earnest with their version of The Stand. Romero went to King with the idea of doing an anthology that focused more on the history of movies. So one story would be shot in black and white, one would be widescreen, one in 3D, etc. It was King's idea to pay tribute to the EC comics of their youth, to make a comic book / horror film that had all the over-the-top cartoonishly gruesome elements of a Tales from the Crypt comic. Rubinstein asked King how long it would take him to write a script, and King responded 60 days. Sure enough, 60 days later, Rubinstein received a copy of the Creepshow screenplay. That said, in an interview from the late 80s, King claimed it only took him a week to write Creepshow. Perhaps he just wanted to remain true to his word to Rubinstein. There was no trouble getting Creepshow off the ground, instead shopping it around Hollywood. Rubinstein went to producer Salah Hassanein, with whom they had a 3-picture deal. Hassanein's company, UFDC, had distributed Dawn of the Dead in the United States, unrated, and the movie was a big success for all involved. A sequel, ultimately titled Day of the Dead, was to be part of the 3-picture deal. So Creepshow was going to fit comfortably into one of the other 2 slots. Creepshow would consist of 5 darkly humorous tales focusing on revenge and just desserts, all with the injection of the supernatural or paranormal. King adapted 2 short stories of his that had previously been published, The Crate and Weeds, while penning 3 original tales, Father's Day, Something to Tide You Over, and They're Creeping Up on You. Other rumored contenders included Old Chief Woodenhead and The Hitchhiker, both of which ultimately made it into Creepshow 2. Bookending the 5 stories would be a wraparound tale about a comic book loving kid, played by King's son Joe Hill, who finds a way to get revenge on his abusive dad, played by the immortal Tom Atkins. Production was going to take place in and around Pittsburgh, Romero's home base where most of his features were made. They turned an abandoned school, Penn Hall Academy, into the soundstage for most of the shooting, though they would venture elsewhere for exterior shots. It's been said that the entire production took approximately 5 months to complete, which is a long time for any feature film. The budget was somewhere in the neighborhood of $8 million. Quite a leap upward for the director used to working under $1 million. For the first time, Romero was going to be working with established names in the cast, as opposed to the unknowns he was used to directing. One reason was that bigger budget, but the main reason was because Romero figured since they only had 10 to 15 minutes to tell their stories, they needed recognizable faces to sell their characters quickly and easily.
Happy Father's Day!
Father's Day is the first tale about a snobby rich family who are greeted by their long-dead patriarch. So fervent is he in his quest for a Father's Day cake he never received, having been killed by his daughter instead. Shooting took place in a mansion owned by a local wig maker, and a crude family cemetery was built in a field near the house. Playing the role of murderous Aunt Bedelia Grantham was Vivica Linfors, a celebrated actress of stage and screen who'd been working for 4 decades until that point. Vivica took the role as her own in many ways, improvising dialogue and creating the character's ragged look. Romero later said Stephen King was unhappy that Vivica veered away from the material he'd written, but Romero loved it during production and let her go wild. A supporting role was played by Ed Harris, who did the part as a favor to Romero after working with him on 1980's Knight Riders. His dance scene is now, shall we say, iconic.
Oh, you done it now, Jordy Verrell? You monkhead!
The second segment, adapted from King's original story, Weeds, is The Lonesome Death of Jordy Verrell. And it's quite memorable for its over-the-top performance by King himself, who was offered the part outright by Romero. And his inherently childish nature seemingly made him a natural for the role of Jordy, a country bumpkin who is unfortunate enough to have a meteorite land in his backyard, one that causes the rapid growth of weeds when opened. Romero urged King to play the character as goofy as possible, with Wile E. Coyote as his main inspiration. With some hesitance, King agreed, although shooting while covered in moss proved to be an uncomfortable experience for the author. Similarly troublesome was adding the ever-growing grass within Jordy's house, which had to be done in incremental stages as the episode goes on. Hence, they had to shoot the segment in sequential order to line up with the hasty growing of the alien weeds.
Nobody's gonna hear you, Harry. Nobody's gonna hear anything.
The silliness of Jordy Verrell is followed by a more dire tone in Something to Tide You Over, a tale of revenge served cold, then served back even colder. An arrogant cuckold played by Leslie Nielsen tortures his wife and her young lover, played by Ted Danson, by burying them up to their necks on the beach and videotaping their watery deaths. Unsurprisingly, the act has consequences from beyond the grave, as the waterlogged lovers force him into the same situation, making him hold his breath for a long time. Equal parts smug and spiteful, Nielsen's Richard Vickers is a nice combination of the serious leading man the actor had played most of his career with some of the deadpan charm he'd soon be famous for. While an absolute professional during shooting, Nielsen was known for being a prankster who carried a small fart machine around with him wherever he went, sending his co-stars and the crew into hysterics. As the unlucky Harry Wentworth, Romero cast Ted Danson. According to Romero, Danson had just shot the pilot for a sitcom about a bar in Boston, which of course would go on to become the mega hit Cheers. Danson had to have a large tank filled with water fitted over his head for the sequence where he drowns, so he frequently had to have air fed to him via a scuba mask during filming. If for whatever reason an emergency occurred, makeup artist Tom Savini was standing nearby with a sledgehammer, ready to smash the tank open at a moment's notice.
Get out of my way, Henry, or I swear to God you'll be wearing your balls for earrings.
The Crate is the fourth segment in the anthology, although it was originally written to be the third, with Something to Tide You Over following it. But because the crate is the longest segment at almost 40 minutes, it was thought it created a bit of lag in the middle of the film, so they were switched. The crate follows an introverted professor named Henry, who is constantly embarrassed by his drunken, loudmouth wife Billy. When Henry's colleague Dexter discovers the unthinkable in the basement of their university, a monster with a lot of teeth and an appetite that has built up over the decades, Henry sees his chance to rid himself of his nagging mate once and for all. Based on a King story published a few years earlier, The Crate features 3 excellent performances by Hal Holbrook, Adrienne Barbeau, and Fritz Weaver. The breakout star of The Crate was Fluffy, the monster who apparently waited very, very patiently under the stairs of a prestigious university. Fluffy was designed by Tom Savini. Savini yearned to create monsters and creatures. Hence, Fluffy gave him his first chance at creating such a beast. Though seen only briefly throughout thanks to clever editing from Star Wars editor Paul Hirsch, Fluffy is easily one of the most memorable aspects of Creepshow. That said, he would be upstaged by critters quite a bit smaller than him in the next segment. The show-stopping, they're creeping up on you.
I found another cockroach this evening, George.
Oh, no.
One of those big ones. Right here in my $3,200 a month penthouse apartment.
This 5th segment almost wasn't made, as the budget was getting very tight and they thought perhaps they had enough with the 4 that were already shot. But Romero and King persisted, knowing the film wouldn't be the same without the very icky tale of Upson Pratt, a germophobic millionaire who conducts all business from his antiseptic penthouse in New York City. While delighting in the suicide of a rival, Pratt finds himself besieged by a scary amount of cockroaches, who invade the pristine confines of his fortress until they finally get to him. And in him. Pratt is played by E.G. Marshall, yet another highly respected veteran actor, and despite the nasty material, he was totally up for sharing the screen, and sometimes his body, with his creepy co-stars. Those things were flown in from Trinidad by entomologists hired by the production, and though they're certainly effective in the final product, they caused headaches for the crew, as they always seemed to find ways to escape the set. Even weeks later, when the crew was tearing the set down, they'd constantly find the unkillable stowaways hiding in every nook and cranny. For the shocking finale, when thousands of roaches emerged from the corpse of Pratt, Savini built a dummy of E.G. Marshall and they fed the insects via large syringes up through the corpse of the model so they'd come spilling out of his nose, mouth, and chest. Yuck. After 5 long months, production ended and editing commenced. Allegedly, the original cut was somewhere in the 3-hour range, too long for a movie of this sort. So an hour was trimmed and the film runs a very engaging 2 hours. Complete with spooky animated sequences and vivid comic book inspired effects to bring the film fully into the realm of a living, breathing EC comic. The producers brought the film to the Cannes Film Festival and created buzz for it by hosting a midnight screening out of competition and inviting all major studio heads to it. Soon after, Warner Brothers agreed to distribute the film in North America, with all international rights going to several other companies. Warner Brothers originally planned on releasing the film right before Halloween, but were dissuaded by the release of Halloween 3: Season of the Witch 1 week prior, which they assumed would be a big hit. They also considered that Halloween weekend is usually light for moviegoing, with most people out trick-or-treating or partying. Warner shifted the release to November 10th, the thought process being there'd be no competition for a movie like Creepshow during the traditionally family-oriented holiday season. The film opened well, collecting $5 million and standing alone as the only George Romero movie to ever open at number 1. Unlike several of its characters, Creepshow's legacy is alive and well. A sequel was released in 1987, and you can find out what the fuck happened to it on this very channel. In 2019, a television adaptation was released on Shudder, and it's still going as strong as ever as of this recording. The macabre spirit King and Romero achieved is clearly still relished by old and new audiences. The film's tagline is, "The most fun you'll have being scared." And we're not going to argue. Now, who's got our cake?
Father's Day. And I got my cake. Oh my God!